नमस्कार, सत श्री अकाल, आदाब और खमा गणी दोस्तों। कहानियों के इस खास कार्यक्रम में आज हम आपको मिलवाएंगे एक ऐसी शख्सियत से जिनका मानना है कि जिंदगी में आगे बढ़ने के लिए व्यक्ति को हमेशा सीखने की प्रवृत्ति अपनानी चाहिए। ये भी इसी सोच के साथ आगे बढ़ी और आज सफलता का ये मुकाम प्राप्त किया। जी हाँ दोस्तों, मुंबई की रहने वाली रुक्मिणी अय्यर की कड़ी मेहनत का ही सफल परिणाम इन्हें मिला है। आज ये एक्सल्ट सॉल्यूशंस की फाउंडर एंड डायरेक्टर है, जिसकी स्थापना इन्होंने 2008 में की थी। ये एक एनएलप प्रैक्टिशनर होने के साथ ही लीडर्स एक्सेलेंस हार्वर्ड स्क्वायर की मेंबर भी है। इसके साथ ही ये कई नेशनल एंड इंटरनेशनल ग्रुप्स की मेंबर एंड लीडर भी है। दोस्तों, आपको बता दें, जिंदगी में ये मुकाम प्राप्त करने के लिए इन्होंने कड़ी मेहनत की और अपने सफर की शुरुआत मुंबई शहर से की। जी हाँ दोस्तों, मुंबई यूनिवर्सिटी से वाणिज्य में स्नातक की डिग्री लेने के बाद ऑर्गेनाइजेशनल साइकोलॉजी के साथ साथ मैनेजमेंट में मास्टर्स की डिग्री इन्होंने प्राप्त की और अपनी पढ़ाई पूरी करने के बाद जिंदगी में एक लक्ष्य के साथ ये आगे बढ़ी और आखिरकार अपने लक्ष्य को हासिल करने में सफल हुई। अपनी इस जर्नी के बीच कई उतार चढ़ाव भी इन्होंने देखे, लेकिन बड़ी ही हिम्मत के साथ उन तमाम हालातों का सामना किया। काफ़ी कुछ अनुभव करने के बाद आज ये एक सफल मुकाम पर आ पहुंची है। दोस्तों, इनकी अब तक की इस जर्नी के बारे में जानने के लिए आइए अब हम सीधा मिलते हैं इनसे और सुनते हैं इनकी ये प्रेरक कहानी इनकी अपनी जुबानी।
My name is Rukmini Iyer. I am based in Mumbai and originally my parents come from Kerala. However, I've grown up in the city for most part of my life except for brief stints abroad in Singapore and in Thailand. So I call Mumbai my home. And I am the founder and director of a consulting practice that's called Exult Solutions. And we work in the areas of leadership and organization development on the corporate side and on peace building on the social and political side. I do because of a whole lot of things, and a lot of it harks back to my childhood. I grew up in an environment where there was a fair bit of domestic violence and abuse, and that had me questioning around what does world peace mean, because I would look at news in the television, I would read newspapers, and I remember when I was a teenager, there were a couple of Indian beauty queens who had won the Miss Universe and Miss World contests, and there seemed to be this trend that the final answer that would win them the crown was typically about world peace. And that made me think about, what does that even mean for a person like me, for a lay person who has no idea about governments or politics? What does world peace even mean? And that took me on this journey of exploring and integrating the idea of peace building into anything and everything that we do in life. Of course, I also had a deep interest in psychology and leadership, and therefore there was a career track that led me into being a consultant in the area of organization and leadership development in the corporate world. And that took me through various leading Indian organizations, including the Hero Group and the Godrej Group of companies. And then my last employment was with a business school in Singapore, where I was teaching and also leading training and development for students as well as faculty. Somewhere during that role in Singapore, where life was really comfortable and everything was in place, there was this deep desire and that question around peace building that came back, and I wanted to do something about it. And I realized that something that I wanted to do about it was not going to happen when I was employed. And therefore, it became an opportunity to uproot myself, bring myself back to India, and begin to explore, how do I set up a work practice that is socially conscious, that integrates corporate work for sustenance and sustainability, as well as look at creating meaningful contributions in the social political space. And so that's how the practice as it exists today in this organization called Exult Solutions got created. So one half of our work is with corporate leaders. I do a lot of facilitation, coaching, and consulting with corporate leaders. primarily to look at what does leadership mean in the context that we live in today, and how do we create conscious businesses. That's the focus in that space. And on the other space, as a conflict resolution specialist, I work on projects which are primarily related to peace education and dialogue. I mainly work with civilians, so large part of this work is track to diplomacy, and some of the work that is currently happening in this space is, for example, in the context of the Ukraine war, we are attempting to set up trauma healing circles for citizens and refugees. We're also attempting to create long-term dialogues between institutions, specifically educational institutions between Ukraine and Russia and so on. So that's the nature of the work that I engage in. Doing what I do, at least when I started off, was rather unusual because it took a lot of effort to even explain the business model, particularly to corporate clients, because they could not quite fathom the interest in the socio-political space. And having said that, in my mind, it was always integrated. We cannot quite separate the personal from the professional from the political, because each of these impact each other. Even if we end up compartmentalizing things in our heads, that's really not our reality. Our reality is integrated, and therefore a lot of initial challenges were really just about explaining what I do to begin with. Of course, there was also this continued challenge, particularly in the early years of the practice, around how do I make it financially sustainable. The initial business model, and that also continues even now, is to ensure that I pay the bills and the bread and butter is taken care of through the corporate consulting work. And then a part of the profits flow into funding peace building work, because funding is always a challenge in this space. And I deliberately did not want the peace building work to be dependent on donations or external funding, but make sure that I'm making enough money in a way that part of it can be channeled into this space. So that was, and at times even now continues to be, a challenge. And the way I have worked with it is primarily through that dialogue. Dialogue, of course, is something that I use as a tool and a technique a lot in the peace building space. And having said that, I also really and very personally believe in the value of dialogue. It does become important to have open and deep conversations with each other in any context, personally or professionally, to help each other understand why we do what we do, what our needs are individually and collectively, and in the process also garner the kind of support that one needs. And for example, in my case, very often the support that I need is simply people being engaged. One great challenge that I find is often around the fact that when it comes to conflicts that are disturbing, such as wars, such as refugees, such as interfaith and interreligious conflicts, which are on the rise in a context like India, the tendency is to disengage unless it hits you very personally. And it is that disengagement that sustains conflict in our society, in our country, and in the world. And it does become really important for the layperson, for you and me, to engage, to learn what it is about. One may not be able to necessarily be in the midst of the action, but it is important to learn, to have the courage to stay disturbed about it, and to at least attempt to resolve it and have conversations with it in one's private circles, or if nothing, within oneself. But that engagement is essential, and that has been one of the primary challenges in doing the work that I do, to create that engagement, to create the capacity and the resilience with people that I work to have those conversations. When I think of the idea of a success mantra, it makes me reflect on how much I've challenged the idea of success itself over the years, in the sense that, yes, I was like a lot of us are educated into believing that success looks a certain way and takes a certain form, that you have a certain amount of money or possessions or a certain kind of status, and so on, is how the mainstream definition of success is. And over the years, I've found myself challenging that and looking at success as what is meaningful to me, and am I maximizing and optimizing my potential at any given moment in time. And the form that it may take and the output that it may have may not necessarily meet a mainstream definition of success, and it does not matter, because I know that I'm doing justice to myself and contributing the best that I can. So if there is a success mantra, I think for me, it is about getting in touch with what success means to me, a very personal definition of it. What I love about my work is the opportunity that I get over and over again in both spaces, both in the socio-political and in the corporate space, the opportunity that I get to touch really deep aspects of human potential, to touch our shared humanity, the needs that all of us have universally, regardless of age, race, gender, or any other demographic parameter. There is something that unites us as humans, and somewhere through my work, whether it's through a coaching conversation or facilitation or a peace dialogue, there is always this opportunity to touch that human core, and I find that really joyous. I am proud of about my own journey has been to trust my intuition and to not be afraid to experiment with a business model that did not quite exist, at least to my knowledge, when I started off. Initially, when I began this work with Exult Solutions, there was this question about, should I stick to a tried and tested, approved kind of a business model which people would be comfortable with, or should I listen to my own intuition and go with it and integrate two very distinct areas of work? And I'm really glad that I did manage to trust my intuition, and it's worked out well, because in doing what I did, there has also been this opportunity to bring that process out in the world, to speak to my clients, to the organizations and institutions I work with, to say that parts of our lives are integrated and we don't have to create separations. And the kind of separations that we create in the nature of work is also a tendency that we carry in other areas of life, and therefore we end up creating separations between life and work. We end up creating separations between different genders and religions and so on. So if we wish to break that pattern elsewhere in life, it is important to break that even professionally, and that's something that I'm very proud of having done. I'm an avid reader, and therefore I've had several people that I've been inspired by. If I have to pick one person, I think for me it would be Rabindranath Tagore. And the reason I'm saying this is because in the context that he lived in, which was extremely high in terms of conflict, politically, in terms of religion, and every which way, even personally for him, he managed to see beauty in life, and he managed to somehow capture that beauty through language, through his poetry, and put that out to the world. And for me, that is a reason for celebrating him, that the fact that he had the strength to in a sustained manner see beauty, even when things around him were really messy. I'm certain he did not have an easy life, but that commitment to seeing something which is beyond the mundane, beyond the ordinary, and that gives us something to aspire for. And I'm sure his writing continues to give strength and hope to so many of us, even generations down the line, and it will continue to do so. So that's one person that comes up as a role model for me. I have to choose between education and experience. I think, go with experience. Having said that, I have 3 master's degrees, so I know I'm standing on loose moral ground when I say that. But the degrees apart, that those were purely because I enjoyed studying what I study, and I continue to learn. I think what is critical in the times that we live in is, no matter who we are, no matter what we are doing, continue to learn. Please uphold learning as a value, because given the nature of the times that we are living in, it is only the learners that can thrive, and the experience that comes from learning that can take us through the times that we live in. If we treat ourselves as being educated, and I mean that in the past, I have some degrees, or I've already achieved certain things, if that's the approach with which we come into life right now, we are extremely prepared for the past, but we're not quite prepared for the present. So it is important to uphold learning as a value. If someone aspires to come into the industry that is leadership and organization development and or peace building, I think one common trait that's extremely useful and also essential in both these spaces is the idea of self-reflection, because we work with a lot of inner processes, and the idea is that what we do within us is what we reflect out in the world. So there is a definite need for the capacity for inner work, for introspection, for reflection, for continual improvement of oneself, in a way that we can give back to the world from that space of constant and continuous development. So that's something I would definitely urge anyone coming into this space to adopt as a trait, and also as a discipline: continuous self-reflection. One thing that COVID has taught all of us from across the world is the fact that we are connected. Right? The fact that no matter what imaginary borders we live with, and what imagined separations we create out of religion and other issues, color of the skin and so on, the mere fact that this tiny invisible virus managed to travel from one unknown wildlife market in China and brought the entire world to a halt shows us how connected we are. And it happened in a matter of days, right? So I think for me, COVID was this huge opportunity, difficult as it was, and perhaps continues to be. It is such a great opportunity for us to really pause and reevaluate what we are doing as humanity, what is really essential, and how much we impact each other, how much my not wearing a mask, for example, could have had an impact on other people's health and perhaps even their lives. So it's brought back to us something that we were perhaps forgetting in the race that we were living in the pre-COVID era. And I hope that it has brought a mindful shift in all of us, that we are connected, and hopefully we live from that awareness going forward. I grew up in this small town called Dombivli, which is now treated as suburban Mumbai. When I grew up, it was pretty much like this village turning into a small town kind of a space. So it was a Maharashtrian cultural hotspot, and there were several well-known Marathi theater people, writers, and people like that who used to live there. So I remember growing up in this space where there was externally a whole lot of conversation around culture, around poetry, around theater, and so on. And I think one of my favorite pastime, so to say, as a child was we would live in this what's now a really old building, but that was one of the only buildings in that area at that point in time. And what was behind the building was this just swampy wasteland where there would be a lot of these pigs coming in with their little piglets and hens going around with their little chickens behind them. And one of my favorite pastimes was really to just stare out of the window and watch that and see pigs growing up and chickens growing up into hens and roosters and so on. I think the whole process of watching and witnessing nature and how life grows is just so nourishing, even if one is not really participating in it, to see a plant grow, to see flowers bloom. And that's something that I carry into my life even now. Even with, living in an apartment in Mumbai, I still continue to maintain potted plants and have a huge amount of delight when there's a flower that blooms, or there's a new leaf that pops up, or something that I've seeded starts growing in. There's this huge joy that I find in nature, and I think that love for nature harks back to those days in childhood where I spent hours gazing out of the window. If I were to go back in a time machine, I'm really tempted to say I would perhaps have, no matter what path I would have followed, I would have definitely come back to doing something similar. At least in terms of, no matter what I was doing, I would have definitely made sure that the peace building work is still a part of whatever is it that I do. I remember looking at career options like being a writer, and I still continue to write and blog a lot. I used to, in the early parts of my career, also freelance as a journalist with some publications, including rediff.com and the Times of India and so on. So that was a career I did consider seriously, but at some point I realized I can write no matter what I'm doing, so I don't really need to be doing that full time. But I'm sure all paths at some point would have led definitely to the peace building space. So I don't see that being cut out of my life, even if I were to do some bit of time travel backward. My work, at least in the pre-COVID days, and I hope it starts again soon, used to give me a lot of opportunity for travel, largely in South Asia and the Middle East, but also sometimes in other parts of the world. And every time I'm out, even when there's a little bit of nature, even if there's one tree or some grass or something, one habit that I have is to create what I call nature mandalas. What I mean by nature mandalas is basically collecting whatever's on the ground, dried leaves and some fallen flowers or stones and twigs and so on, and arranging them in a way that that forms a pattern, forms a design. Most Indians would understand the idea of a rangoli, right, where you draw something with colors. Think of this as a nature-based rangoli. You're using elements from nature instead of colors, and that's something that I really enjoy doing. It's kind of play, and it is also a way to get my hands dirty, but it's a great creative process for me in trying to find the beauty in a withered flower, trying to trace the journey of a leaf that's fallen off and dried. I find that an extremely nourishing process. Here's a Marathi poem which I really love the lyrics of, and it's also set into song by several musicians. And this comes to mind as I think of my own journey and that of my dear ones, and therefore it's also a dedication to everyone who's been part of my life. And here it goes. Anandaya Jivanacha Sugandha Pari Darvarawa Pavyatala Surajesa Otha Tumi Udarawa. The way it goes is that the joy that each of us experiences in life, we need to spread that like a fragrance. And it's easy to do that. It's like how wind escapes from a flute and it spreads across, the sound spreads across really easily without any effort on part of the flutist. That's how joy is meant to spread out of each of us into our world. And I hope and pray all of us have the opportunity to experience both receiving and sending out that joy. Leadership is a potential that exists in all of us, and the first task, and I don't think this is an option, the first task of leadership for all of us is to lead oneself. And that's something that life gives each of us an opportunity to do, no matter who we are. What we can perhaps choose to do is also extend that leadership beyond ourselves to perhaps our teams, our organizations, larger systems that we live in. And that's a continual journey. I don't think there's really ever an end in terms of building those leadership capacities within ourselves. And also, the self-leadership element continues to get built as we explore and experience development in ourselves as a leader of people or systems or politics or whatever other ways in which we want to frame it. But self-leadership, I think, is essential and necessary for each of us to explore very actively. Really, the call of our times to be entrepreneurial in anything that we do. Even if you wish to be employed, there is still opportunity for what's termed as intrapreneurship and instead of entrepreneurship. But one message that I definitely have when I look back at my own journey on this path is to make sure that you mindfully develop your own resilience. And what I mean by resilience is that ability to bounce back no matter how challenging times get. A lot of times entrepreneurs particularly believe that they need to be always in this performance zone, always out there and giving their best. And it is important to remember that that can only be sustained when you actively create time to recharge, to rest, to rejuvenate yourself physically, mentally, emotionally. So actively creating that balance, scheduling it, putting it on your calendar becomes really important as an entrepreneur, because otherwise it's really easy to get lost in work. There's always more to do. There always will be. And it's important to keep oneself fit to be able to do that by also celebrating rest as much as we celebrate life and work. For watching and listening to my story. If you feel inspired by it, then please do go ahead, share it on your social media or with your circles in other forms. And spread the message of joy. Live in times that are challenging and we continually need inspiration to refuel us. So if you'd like to hear more such stories, please do come on to this wonderful Workmark platform and browse through to listen to more stories like this. Thank you.
दोस्तों, आप सुन रहे थे एक्सल्ट सॉल्यूशंस की फाउंडर एंड डायरेक्टर रुक्मिनी अय्यर की कहानी इनकी अपनी जुबानी। ऐसी ही प्रेरक कहानियाँ रोजाना सुनने के लिए चैनल को सब्सक्राइब करें और बेल आइकन जरूर दबाएं। और अगर आज की ये कहानी आपको पसंद आई है तो इसे लाइक, कमेंट और शेयर करना ना भूलें। अब आप भी बन जाइए भारत की प्रोफेशनल कम्युनिटी की आवाज़ और सुनाओ अपनी कहानी, बनाओ अपनी पहचान की इस मुहिम से जुड़कर अपने जीवन के अनुभवों, कार्यक्षेत्रों और अपने उत्पादों एवं सेवाओं के पीछे की वास्तविकता से देशवासियों को प्रेरित करें और अपने अनुभवों से अपनी एक नई पहचान बनाएं। Tell your story, inspire and build your brand with the power of video. जय हिंद, जय भारत।